Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Teachit around metacognition. So my name is Chris Runeckles. I work within the Research School network. I'm Assistant Director of Durrington Research School down on the South Coast. And over the last few years, I've developed a bit of a specialism around metacognition and self-regulated learning. That's mainly come through my work in the Research School network, also some other things I've become interested in myself in my own practice, particularly through my teaching of history and looking at becoming a more evidence-informed leader and practitioner there. So you may have heard of the Education Endowment Foundation's guidance report, Metacognition and Self-regulated learning. I was involved with making some resources there for teachers to sort of help interpret that. And I've also been trying to implement it in my own setting at my secondary school, which is also Durrington. So Teachit asked me to put together one of these webinars, about 30 minutes, just kind of going through some principles around metacognition. You know, it's this really intangible topic, metacognition. It's something that's talked about a lot. You'll see it popping up on improvement plans and in teaching and learning policies, and it'll be talked about at various inset sessions and department meetings. And it has become a little bit of an educational zeitgeist. You know, it's kind of everywhere at the minute. And there are some really good reasons for that, why it's everywhere. And I think, you know, I'm definitely a convert. You know, I really believe in it, genuinely. I think if we get it right, the effects for our children and students, you know, could be absolutely transformational. But as I said, it is really intangible. It's hard to turn it into, you know, clear interventions, things to do, what we do on Monday morning with metacognition. So what I've tried to do with this session, because it's only a short one, and, you know, I run 3-day training programs around metacognition. So, you know, half an hour is obviously only so much we can do. What I've tried to do with this is kind of give you a broad understanding of metacognition, try to really help people get to a point of understanding with it, of what it actually means. And then just give 2 really practical suggestions for what you can do with metacognition going forward and how perhaps you might want to use it in your practice. And hopefully that will be useful and just sort of spark a few ideas and give you some things to take away, and, you know, perhaps lead to some further reading around the topic. So that, as I say, that's the title of the webinar today is Mobilising Metacognition. Really, the focus is kind of what we do with it, but also understanding what it is. So we're going to start with the kind of understanding what it is for the first part, and then move on to that as we go through. So here's the first big question. What actually is metacognition? And you'll see so many different definitions of it out there. You know, if you Google it, you're going to find all kinds of different definitions of metacognition, what it actually means. And you know, it is one part of what we might call self-regulated learning is something that's worth mentioning right at the start, is that self-regulated learning is kind of the umbrella term with metacognition, and which metacognition falls within. Okay, so as a self-regulated learner, you have kind of cognition, which is the toolbox of strategies you've got to solve any particular problem. So those are the things you know how to do, and they're really, really important. Obviously, you can't do anything without the cognitive strategies to be able to solve a problem. Then you have metacognition, which is how you deploy those strategies, how you think about them. And then you have motivation, which is whether you can actually be bothered to do it in the first place. And you need all of those to be a self-regulating learner. So metacognition is one part of being a self-regulating learner, but it's, you know, and it's not any more or less important than those other 2, but it is essential if we're going to be self-regulating. And metacognition is often the sort of mystery part of self-regulated learning. We can kind of articulate quite well, you know, what perhaps we know what to do in a situation, and we can probably tell someone whether we can be motivated. What we might be unaware of is our metacognitive thinking around it. So we need to go into a little bit more detail now, and just sort of look at some definitions of metacognition that have appeared over the years, because it's nothing new, is the other thing to say. So if we go right back to the 70s, first of all, with the first person to coin the phrase metacognition, Flavell, in the 70s. And this is his sort of definition here, or one of his definitions here, of what metacognition actually means. So it's that, as it says there, engaging in metacognition if I notice that I'm having more trouble learning A than B, if it strikes me that I should double check C before accepting it as fact. And reading that, you can kind of understand why metacognition often gets referred to as thinking about thinking, because essentially that double checking of the processes that's being referred to there, you can sort of understand why that would be term thinking about thinking. I think the part that term thinking about thinking misses is the purposeful element of it. Okay, actually making a conscious decision that you're going to do something with the information that you're noticing. Thinking about thinking can essentially be quite idle. It doesn't necessarily go anywhere, but it's that purposeful element that I think is important in there to recognise. Right, then it's been taken on by various other people. One of the another person to have done an awful lot of research in this area is Zimmerman. So another quote there for you to, I'm not going to read this full one out because it's rather long. So I'll let you just have a sec to just read that one. Okay, so bringing some other elements into it here, thinking about motivation here is coming through, because that is, as I said, a really key element of being a self-regulated learner, about how we set our goals, about how aware we are of our strengths and our limitations, and how good a judge we are actually of that, because often, research tells us that we can be quite a poor judge of our own learning and where we are at any given moment. So self-regulating learners, nicely described that. And the final definition I'm going to give you is actually from the Education Endowment Foundation, where, the authors of the guidance report that was published in 2018, which I would really, really recommend as a resource to tap into. It's available online. Just Google it, you'll find it, and just gives 7 really clear recommendations of what teachers can do in terms of, making a metacognition something usable. And I think, that's a really good place to start. But within that guidance report is this quote: metacognition is about the way learners monitor and purposefully direct their learning. So there you go. The thinking about thinking, the monitoring, being aware of those thoughts around learning, but key, actually then using those to direct your learning in some way. And that's being metacognitive. It's not an awareness, it's a decision. It's actually saying, okay, well, I'm aware of that, so I'm going to do X as a result. And that's metacognition. And it's everywhere. It's in all facets of learning. So it doesn't matter what learning you're doing, there's the potential to be metacognitive within that learning. And for that reason, we've got to explicitly teach it, because it's not just it's going to happen or it's not. We know it can be taught. So why is it worth the bother? Why is it worth the bother? Why should we invest our time in metacognition as opposed to anything else, all the other hundreds of things we could choose to invest our time in as teachers? We've got a finite amount of time. Why this over anything else? And I think, I would draw on a bit of Education Endowment Foundation research here, their meta-analysis of different teaching interventions known as the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which I know lots of people are very familiar with and use. And if you rank order that toolkit on, the impact column, this measure that they use to say, the additional month's progress a learner will make if they get that intervention and it's done in the best possible way, metacognition sits at the top of the list, above feedback even, above reading comprehension strategies, above things that have been absolutely fundamental to teachers' practice for years. And yet we're saying here, or the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is giving us a steer here, that actually this one above the others if done, to maximum capacity. And there's loads of context here, and all these big kind of headlines are always an issue because, well, what about, is it the same for a secondary school in the Northeast as it is for a primary school in Cornwall? All of those factors are important. But taking all that into account, we're still saying metacognition sits at the top there. So for that reason, it's got to be worth our time and our effort and a real investment. So, and I don't mean an investment in terms of money necessarily, but an investment in terms of time, in terms of professional development, and in terms of, what we actually do in a day-to-day basis in our lessons. So, I really recommend, therefore, sort of drilling into that and looking beyond just the headline and all the stuff that sits underneath that toolkit. So that's the why, I guess. That's why this is worth our time. And the second part of why it's worth our time comes back to this idea of moral purpose, what we're doing. And this comes back to disadvantage. And when we look at our different strategies around pupil premium, around disadvantage, around how we actually break that link between family income and outcomes, how we break that, metacognition is absolutely one of our best bets to do that. Because, as it says here, this is again taken from the same place, we have some evidence to suggest that disadvantaged pupils are less likely to use metacognitive and self-regulatory strategies without being explicitly taught them. Now, we've got to be careful always with generalizations around disadvantage. They're not a homogenous group. There's always going to be, more difference than similarity in that cohort. But what we see on average is that trend. Now, there's going to be all sorts of potential reasons for that. And it might be to do with their experience at home, for why they might have fewer metacognitive strategies. They're less likely to employ that. It might have been, it might be the nature of questions they've been asked prior to school or around school that might have, not induced that thought so much. As I say, all of these are generalizations. You've got to be careful with that. But if our kind of moral purpose is to bridge the gap between disadvantaged students and their non-disadvantaged peers, if we're here to level the playing field, which I think to a large degree we are, then I think, metacognition, absolute one of our best bets of being able to do that, because we can explicitly teach those disadvantaged students to have that same kind of have a go confidence that their, less disadvantaged peers might exhibit. And one of the ways we can do that is help them be in charge of their own learning and actually own it. And that's what metacognition can do for students. So that's the why. That's my sales pitch for why we should bother with it. Okay, going to do a bit of myth busting next, because as I say, this is a bit of a zeitgeist. There's a lot of it about. And so as a result, there's quite a lot of misconceptions that exist out there around metacognition and what it is and what it isn't. Okay, so firstly, that it's only developed in older pupils. Absolutely not. Okay, we can look at metacognition right from early years. Okay, so you can look at metacognition in the early years setting. We can explicitly teach early years children to self-regulate their behavior in imaginative play. That is metacognition. It's being able to recognize that, if you can't always be the character you want to be in that imaginative play, what do you do in that situation? How do you cope with that? Okay, so sometimes metacognition is portrayed as something that's just for older students, and it's to do with, dealing with really complex ideas. And that's not the case. So metacognition is for all phases. Right, number 2, myth. It can't be separated from subject knowledge. We can't teach metacognition as metacognition lessons and then expect our students to be metacognitive in all of their different lessons as a result. We need to teach metacognition in the domain in which it's going to be used. So metacognition should be taught alongside the subject knowledge that we want to convey. Often metacognition is seen as kind of this higher order thinking. It's more important than cognition or subject knowledge. Not at all. It is one aspect of being a self-regulated learner. It's no more or less important than any other aspect of being a self-regulated learner. So, for that reason, we don't need to, put it on some sort of pedestal and think that it represents some sort of higher order thinking that's, not available to every learner. It's absolutely not the case. Okay, I kind of referenced this with the other one, but I think, again, one of the myths around metacognition is we can teach it as thinking skills, and all the evidence is we can't. Okay, we've got to teach it in the domain. We've got to put it alongside what we want them to be metacognitive with. And I'm going to exemplify that. Right, a model of metacognitive thought then. Okay, this is a model of metacognitive thought, also stolen from the Education Endowment Foundation. So this model I like. There's various different ones you can find. I particularly like this one. And it's also worth saying, as soon as you write thinking down on a page, it's immediately flawed. Thinking's messy. You can't just write it down in an infographic and it's, perfectly exemplifies it. That's not how thinking works. But for me, this just helps me articulate what we mean by metacognitive thought. Okay, so let's imagine we've got our cognitive strategies and that we've got our motivation. Okay, so the metacognitive thinking that would go alongside that. So the top layer there, first of all, because we start with that, is our metacognitive knowledge. It's how well we know the task that's in front of us. It's how well we know the strategies that go into completing that task effectively. And it's how well we know ourselves and how we respond to that sort of task. What we struggle with within it, what we enjoy within it, how long it generally takes us. So all of those things. So we have that metacognitive knowledge that we can deploy. Okay. Then we have metacognitive regulation there at the bottom. So that is how well we use that knowledge to plan, monitor, and evaluate. So before, during, and after. So, how well do we know that task? How does that affect how we plan to do it successfully? What strategies have we got? Are we monitoring ourselves as we're doing it, thinking, okay, that strategy is working really well? Oh, no, it's not actually. I'm going to bring in this other strategy that I know is going to help me here. Evaluative regulation. So at the end of it, are we thinking, okay, I got that a bit wrong today. I thought I was going to do better in that. I think I've misjudged actually how good I am at that, how confident I am with that. So I need to sort of think about that and change something. So it's that thinking that's going on. That is metacognition. It's that purposeful direction of our learning that's being metacognitive. And, the good news here is it doesn't have to just be left to chance. We can explicitly teach students to be metacognitive. But in order to do so, we've got to force them to think in this way. So we've got to have strategies for forcing them to think in this way, which I'm going to come to in a bit. But before I get to those, I just want to exemplify this metacognitive thinking a little bit. So this is something that I've been very metacognitive about recently. So I would say there's a few things I'm trying to learn at the moment, and I'm various degrees of metacognition with them. So I'm trying to learn Italian. I'm not metacognitive at all. Probably a motivation issue there, to be honest. So do I think about it in between those little sessions on my phone trying to learn it? No, I don't. Do I consider my strengths and weaknesses? No, I don't. Okay, I'm not metacognitive at all. However, I'm also trying to learn to master this, my Kamado Joe barbecue. So apologies if this is a bit of a sales pitch. Other reputable barbecue providers are, I'm sure, available. But this is the one I went for. Bit of a big present, big birthday this year. And this was my present to myself for this. And I have become hugely metacognitive when it comes to mastering the art of barbecuing on these particularly complicated barbecues. So I use this because it's a good way of exemplifying kind of metacognitive thinking. Okay, so this is my task. I want to master the Kamado Joe barbecue. So first of all, I'd have to think about my cognitive tools that I've got. What cognitive strategies am I going to need in order to be good at this thing? Okay, making marinades, time management, cookery knowledge, the reverse. If you don't know about reverse searing, look it up. It's a game changer for your red meat, is the reverse sear. I'm sure there's reverse sear on, for those of vegans or vegetarians out there, I'm sure there's the equivalent. But personally, as a still a slightly embarrassed red meat eater, I'm very much using the reverse sear on my red meat. Lighting fires, using vents, all about the vents for these barbecues. I don't know if you've come across them, but it's very much about the vents and getting them in the right place. So these are cognitive tools. These are cognitive strategies. This is my toolbox of things that I can deploy to be good at this task. So then my metacognition are these sort of questions that I would be asking myself. So like these questions, I'm going to go through and sort of talk about what aspect of metacognitive regulation they might be covering. So that sort of question, was the reverse searing worth it? So to be an evaluative, self-regulating learner after producing that ribeye steak, I would be going, was that worth it? Was it any better than the one I cooked without doing that? If it wasn't, I'm not going to do it again because it's a lot of time. Okay, actually, I do think it was worth it. I am going to do that again. That question, how can I get everything to come together? That would be metacognitive planning. So I'm thinking, okay, I've got all these toolbox of strategies. I've got to deploy them at the right time in order for everything to come together in the way that I want it to. Okay, that is being metacognitive. It's that sort of purposeful direction of my learning, of wanting to get better, that allows me to learn at a faster rate, essentially. Now, if I'm highly motivated, I want to be good at this, so I will invest time in it. I will watch YouTube videos from men from the deep south of America telling me how to cook a swordfish steak. I'm prepared to do that. So perhaps it's easy for me to be metacognitive here. Obviously, in school, we're battling sometimes with motivation levels, so it's harder to engender that. But what we can do is explicitly teach our children, our students, to think in this way with the kind of tasks we want them to do. So that's really what I mean by metacognition, metacognitive regulation. It's the sort of deployment of strategies based on your knowledge of yourself and the task and all of that, and how you deploy them and when you deploy them, that turns you into a metacognitive self-regulating learner. So just pause, for a second, and having gone through that, think through what are the skills, behaviours and traits of the most effective pupils in your school that you teach. And find that student in your head and think, are they displaying these metacognitive traits? Because I bet they are. I bet they're the ones asking you at the end of the lesson, to unpick something with them. I bet they're the ones who, after an assessed piece of work, are asking you really good, insightful questions about why it was good or why it was bad. Okay, these are the ones who you see diligently planning out what they're going to do before they do it. It's not a coincidence that the two things connect together. Now, there is a way of kind of categorizing metacognitive learners. This comes from Perkins from the early 90s, which is actually 4 layers of metacognitive learner that we can talk about as a way of kind of articulating what we mean by different metacognitive learners. So at the base layer are tacit learners. These are learners that are unaware of metacognitive knowledge. They don't think about strategies for learning. They just accept whether they know something or they don't. Okay, so they wouldn't be tirelessly watching those YouTube videos like me. The aware learners, they know that there's some kinds of thinking they do that generates ideas, but it's not necessarily deliberate or planned. So they're sort of aware that you can affect your learning by, directing it, but it's not very planned at the moment. Then we have, and I think we have lots of these in school, strategic learners. So they organise their thinking by using problem solving, grouping, classifying. They know and apply strategies, but they do it in quite a directed way. So these are the sort of students who might say to you, is this going to be on the test? And you say no. And they say, well, why are we doing it then? Because they're very sort of task focused. So they will choose to use a strategy because they've been told it's effective. But then our gold standard of metacognitive learner would be our reflective learners. Not only are they strategic, but they also reflect on it. And they consider whether the strategy's been successful or not. And they change them and revise them depending on what they discover in that train of thought. So I'd say that's our kind of gold standard metacognitive learner. We don't find an awful lot of reflective learners, but that's where we're trying to get to through our explicit teaching. So last part from me, I want to give you a couple of things that you can actually try with this now. Because if our goal is to change the way our students think, we need to show them how to think. And I think one of the best ways we can do that is what we say to the students. And I would look at that through metacognitive modeling and metacognitive questioning. Okay, so metacognitive modeling is all about how we model our thinking as well as actually what we need to do. And metacognitive questioning are asking the sort of questions that are going to elicit the sort of thought that I've been talking about in this session. So let's start with metacognitive thinking first. Right, the way I'm going to show this is with a non-example and an example and a non-example. So I'm going to start with the non-example first here. And as I'm a history teacher, I've done this as a history one first of all. So this is the non-example of me starting to model how to write a paragraph in history. So I'm saying something like, the first sentence of our answer always needs to include words from the question so that we focus our area in the right area. And I write that sentence. Next, I need to include key pieces of precise evidence that are going to support my point. And I write my second sentence, giving my historical facts. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that as modelling. But to turn that into metacognitive modelling, it might look more like this. The first thing I think about when I'm going to start writing is, how can I actually make sure I directly answer this question? One simple way I know I can do that is I pick out words from the question to include in my first sentence, because I know if I get the first sentence right, then my paragraph's going to be well focused. Then I write my first sentence. Next, I'm thinking, what do I know about this topic that's actually relevant to the point I've made? Here I tend to pause for a bit to run through the knowledge I've got, make some choices about which piece of evidence will best support my point, and then once I've made a decision, I'm going to start writing again. So what I'm doing is I'm lifting the veil on the thought processes that are going on as I'm making these expert choices in how to write. Okay, and often what we end up doing as teachers is we go straight into modelling the full process without actually demonstrating what sits behind the process, which is the expert thinking. And that can be really difficult for students to follow, because it can be like you're magically clever and that this stuff just sort of happens naturally. So what they need from modelling is that to be unpacked in front of them, to actually show where that information comes from. If I give you one other example of that. So this would be the non-example, an example for in a primary setting, if we're doing some creative writing using adverbs. So again, we've got a non-example here that, as I say, I'll let you read this one rather than me reading it out. Okay, so again, showing what to do. And then we have our example of the metacognitive modelling, which again, I'll let you read through. So hopefully you can see the kind of differences between them, this unpacking of thinking in front of children, so they know, how you're able to be good at this, how you're able to be expert in this, what are the processes sitting behind, the ability to complete the task in the way that you do. And we want to exemplify that. And modelling is a really effective way of doing it. And we can even do that with the students as well. So, a primary colleague was telling me about a situation recently where they had been watching a lesson and the teacher had asked, does anyone know anything about Rosa Parks? Student puts their hand up, stands up, gives this biography of Rosa Parks, perfect. And the teacher says, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. We've learned lots from that. Sit back down. Now there's an opportunity where you can say, okay, how do you know that? Where's that information gone? And if they had, the student would have told them that they had a book that was read to them on a regular basis as their favourite book, and having been read to it over and over again, that information was lodged in their head. Okay, the other children can see where this is coming from, not that this person's magically clever. I think that's a really key point. So the other strategy I want to give you before we finish is metacognitive questioning. So we ask hundreds of questions every day as teachers. How many of them are metacognitive questions? How many of them are the questions that actually really make them reflect on their learning in the way that we want them to? So I've put together, adapted from various different places, some metacognitive questions that we could potentially ask. Now, these are not exhaustive and they need contextualizing. And some are going to work in situations and some are not. But if we ask these sort of questions at the end of our strings of questions regularly, that's going to force the sort of thinking around metacognition that we want our students to engage in. Asking a simple question like, why do we do tasks like this? Now, how often do we do those quizzes at the start of lessons, how often do we actually say, why do we do quizzes? What's the point? Or what different strategies did we use today at the end of a piece of work? Or, how difficult are you finding this task? What are the biggest challenges here? So here are some just sort of practical questions that you can just start asking. And I like this because, if we're looking about changing our habits, this is a tweak that we can make, and we can just start asking these. For me, I have a version of this pinned up in my classroom so that it just prompts me every now and again to look and go, okay, this is a moment I can ask one of these. And, I know teachers and colleagues I work with have adapted them, made them relevant for their practice. So, something to have a go at, asking some of these metacognitive questions, because the more they ask them, the more it forces them to think in that self-regulating metacognitive way that we want them to think. And incrementally over time, I feel like that's going to make a change to the way they think, so that when those questions aren't asked, they're still having the same thoughts. And ultimately, that's what we want, because metacognition at the end of the day is about student behavior. It's not about teacher behavior. It's about how they think. And so the teacher input is trying to affect the way they think, which is hard, which is why it's difficult to implement, which is why it kind of feels out of reach off of metacognition. So to finish, 3 reflective questions. Do I have a working understanding of what metacognition is? So, if you haven't got that, it's very hard to do anything meaningful with it. Which metacognitive questions can I ask over the next 2 weeks? Because that's how this will change something. And thirdly, how can I include my thought process when modelling over the next 2 weeks? So a little bit of homework for you there. So I really hope that's been useful and that you've enjoyed that. If you think that metacognition is for you, there's a wealth of information out there. Please get involved, and best of luck with it. Thank you.